good morning, neighbor. I'm so glad you stopped by. Today, we're going to be talking about shortages, but not shortages of today. We're going to be talking about during the Great Depression, what items were in short supply. Believe it or not, the first thing was sugar. And they had shortages on sugar, coffee, meat, fish, gasoline, butter, eggs, cheese, shoes, and rubber because they used that for the tires. Now, you see in this video a pair of child shoes, and they're pretty beat up. These are or were my mother's childhood shoes in the Great Depression. I have kept them all these years, and so these were the shoes that she wore in the Great Depression. I'm sure they looked better back then, but there was a shortage of shoes, so shoes were passed down from child to child. This was basically a generic pair of shoes, so it could have been her brother's, and then her sister's, and then hers. She was the youngest of three. So the shortages were real, and people learned how to take care of their things, how to reuse things, how to do the best they could with whatever they had. Those were a lot of the shortages. Now, from these shortages came some very interesting recipes. Since they were short on all these food items, they had to be very creative with what they ate. One of them was stovetop baked beans. It was cheap, it was easy, and you could add different seasonings if you had them, or herbs, or onions or garlic, whatever you had in your garden. Wacky cake. It was called depression cake. Obviously, it didn't have much butter or sugar or things that were in short supply. Navy bean soup. This consisted of navy beans, carrots, ham if you could find it, or a ham bone, onion, and garlic. And most people had a pot of beans on the stove at all times. So during the day, if people got hungry, they could come in and get a bowl of beans and maybe a big piece of cornbread if they had it, or some bread, and they had lunch, breakfast, or dinner. Chocolate cream pie. Believe it or not, that came out of the Great Depression. It was very popular back then. One of the things that I really enjoy is dandelion salad. Now, kids and adults alike would go out and pick the dandelions, and they would pull them root and all. They would take the tender green leaves of the dandelion. They would wash them thoroughly, and they would make a dandelion salad. Put olive oil on it, maybe add salt, pepper, whatever they had, some garlic, and they could eat it as a salad, or they could saute it and make a side dish. They could even put it in different soups. And then they did take the roots, clean them thoroughly, and cook them or roast them and chop them up, and that was their coffee if they didn't have anything else, because a roasted dandelion root chopped up and dried, when you make a tea from it, is very dark and very strong, almost like coffee. And potato soup was very popular. Potatoes were easy to grow. They were plentiful because people had gardens. Peanut butter bread. That was another thing that when they had peanut butter, they would add that to bread, and it would make the bread have more protein. Old-fashioned cornbread. Some people call it water cornbread. They had very few items to add to cornbread. Maybe not a lot of eggs and milk and butter and everything that we have today. So they learned how to modify the recipes to where it still tasted pretty good, And especially if you had some jam that was homemade or honey, you could put on top of that with the bowl of beans, and you were good to go. Depression era bread. Again, not many ingredients, just the basics, whatever they could find. It only had 3 ingredients. I do not have the recipe for that, but I will be having the recipe for these items very soon. Another thing that came along was vegetable cabbage soup. Again, vegetables and which cabbage is, and other vegetables may have been grown in the garden. And you could pull those, chop them up, and make a soup out of it. It was hearty. It was good for the wintertime. Another use for potatoes would be potato pancakes. And Hoover Stew. This was named after Herbert Hoover. It had macaroni, tomatoes, canned corn, and chopped up hot dogs. That was Herbert Hoover Stew. Chipped beef on toast. A lot of people ate some of this when they were in the Great Depression or World War II, and they can't stand it. Some restaurants today have this, and it's a big hit. Next would be frozen fruit salad. Again, you see that fruits and vegetables seem to be plentiful because they couldn't ship it out different places, and so people had fruit trees in their yard. They had nut trees in their yard, and they grew gardens. Rice pudding. This is something that's popular even today. Rice pudding you can bake it. You can add cinnamon, sugar, raisins, whatever you would like, diced apples, and it becomes a very good dessert, or it could be lunch or breakfast. Now, my grandmother obviously, she lived through the Great Depression. They had a cow and they had chickens, and she made her own butter. And people would come by, she said, by her back gate, and it was a small farm. She said they would come by the back gate on their way to a railroad track or whatever it might be, going on the rails and the trains to try to find a job. Every morning she would make fried egg sandwiches. It would consist of her homemade bread, a fried egg, and lots of butter on there, and she would wrap it just in paper, whatever paper she had. And she would unlock the gate, and she would hand out these fried egg sandwiches to the men, usually, that were headed for the railroad track to get on the train to go and try to find some work. She felt really good about this because she felt fortunate. She had a cow. She could make, butter. She had chickens, she had eggs, and she had enough to where she could make the bread. These are just some of the things that maybe we need to think about, fixing and looking at and working with what we have. Another thing that was really popular at the time, became popular, was lot gardens. And if they had an empty lot somewhere, they would make it into a neighborhood garden, a community garden. They grew as much as they possibly could. If you're on a farm, of course, you had crops in the fields. The people in the city had the bread lines, soup lines, and they got a bowl of soup and a piece of bread, and they would stay in line for hours. Now, the people that lived in the country, they had food. They may not have had a lot of clothes and shoes and things of that nature, but they have food because they grew food. One of the people that I spoke with said they really never knew that there was a shortage of food because they never went hungry. They always had food. Now, they didn't have much for Christmas, and they didn't have much for any holidays, and the shoes and things of that nature, clothes, were in very short supply because they didn't have money. But they were never hungry. Well, I am so glad you stopped by this morning. I just thought this would be interesting to put up. Not many people saved a small child's pair of shoes from the Great Depression, but I did. These were my mother's. And it just shows how people really had to make do with very little. I'm sure at the end of using these shoes, she was more than happy to get rid of them and maybe get a new pair of shoes. If you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos. And in the comments, let me know if you have any memorabilia or family heirlooms from the Great Depression, and how are you going to handle the shortages that we have today that are happening in the stores right now? Are you going to use some of these recipes that I mentioned in the video? Well, I'm so glad you stopped by, and I hope to see you soon.